You don't get to sit here. Move. Marcus Whitfield stood at the threshold of first class on Flight 447, Charlotte to Denver, one hand still curled around the strap of a scuffed brown duffel bag, and heard those 4 words land on him like a slammed door. The cabin smelled of espresso and leather polish. A soft chime rang somewhere near the galley. Champagne caught the light in 2 crystal flutes. Nobody had touched yet. Then a woman's voice cut through all of it, sharp as a paper cut, aimed straight at his chest. He looked down at his boarding pass. Seat 2A, Charlotte to Denver, first class, paid in full 3 weeks ago with his own card. He looked up. A woman in an ivory cashmere wrap sat exactly where the pass told him to sit, her Louis Vuitton tote parked on the middle seat like a sentry, ankles crossed, chin already tilted at the particular angle of someone who has decided the conversation is over before it starts. Her name, though nobody in that cabin knew it yet, was Deborah Sinclair-Voss, 61 years old, widow of a Charlotte real estate developer, a woman who had flown this exact route to her second home in Aspen for 11 years running, and who had, in that time, come to believe that certain seats simply belonged to her the way certain restaurant tables belong to regulars. Marcus was 38. Jeans, a gray Henley, scuffed leather boots that had walked a lot farther than any runway carpet. No watch, no rings, no laptop bag slung with a designer logo. Just a tired man who'd been in 3 time zones in 4 days and wanted, more than almost anything, to close his eyes before Denver. But Deborah Sinclair-Voss did not see tired. She saw an inconvenience wearing the wrong clothes. I said, "Move," she repeated, not looking up from her phone now, as if the matter had already been settled and he was simply slow to receive the memo. "This is my seat. I sit here every single time." Marcus held his boarding pass out, steady, at eye level. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mix-up. This says 2A. She didn't take it. She looked at it the way you'd look at something a dog dragged in from outside. "I don't care what it says. I've flown this route longer than you've probably owned a suit." A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper an inch. A woman 2 rows back glanced up from her tablet screen. Boarding slowed behind Marcus, a rolling suitcase wheel squeaking to a stop somewhere near row 4. And at the front galley, flight attendant Casey Doran, 29 years old, 3 years into this job, and already fluent in the particular silence that falls over a cabin right before something goes wrong, turned her head toward the sound. She had already made up her mind before she took a single step. The woman in cashmere looked like money that tipped well and wrote strongly worded letters to corporate. The man in the doorway looked like a problem she'd rather not have. She didn't know yet that she was about to be catastrophically, permanently wrong. The kind of wrong that gets typed up in an incident report with her name at the top. Marcus did not raise his voice. He had learned a long time ago in rooms with far higher stakes than a coach-to-first upgrade. That volume was for people who had nothing else to work with. He simply stood there, ticket in hand, breathing slow, and waited for the world to catch up to a fact that was not, in itself, complicated. He thought, for just a second, of his grandmother, Odessa Whitfield, who used to sit him down at her kitchen table in Greensboro and tell him, "Baby, they can try to make you small. Don't you ever help them do it." She'd said it to him after the 3rd time a hotel clerk asked for 2 forms of ID from him and none from the white businessman behind him. She'd said it to him the year she was denied a mortgage on a house 2 streets over from ones she'd cleaned for 30 years. She was gone 11 months now, and Marcus carried a small brass button from her church coat in his jacket pocket, the way some men carry a coin. He touched it now, once, through the fabric, and let his hand fall back to his side. "Ma'am," Casey Doran said, arriving with a smile stretched a size too tight. "Is there a problem?" Deborah looked up at last, radiant with the particular relief of an audience arriving. "Yes. This man is refusing to let this go. I've asked him nicely to take another seat." Marcus's eyes moved to Casey, calm, unhurried. My boarding pass says 2A. I'd like to see hers. Something flickered across Deborah's face. Not shame, not yet, but the first hairline crack in the plaster of her certainty. It's on my phone, she said, too quickly, and turned the screen toward Casey with a sharp little flick of her wrist. The gesture of someone who expected the matter closed the instant the phone appeared. Casey looked down. 3C, still first class, still perfectly comfortable, not 2A. For one long second, the truth simply stood there in the aisle between them, plain as the drink cart. Casey felt heat climb up the back of her neck. And that is the exact moment you should remember, because everything that happens next in this story, the humiliation, the standoff, the phone call that will end 3 careers before the plane even leaves the runway, starts here with one flight attendant's decision about whose comfort mattered more. Deborah recovered fast. She always did. She leaned in toward Casey and lowered her voice to the register people use when they want a room to overhear something private. Sweetheart, I fly this route every month. I know how this works. Just put him somewhere else. Somewhere else. Marcus had heard those 2 words his entire adult life, dressed in 100 different outfits. Somewhere else in the loan officer's back room in 2009, when he'd been quietly redirected to someone who specializes in your kind of application. Somewhere else in the boutique hotel lobby in Savannah in 2015, when the concierges suggested a more suitable property 2 blocks down without ever explaining suitable for what. Somewhere else at his own father's funeral reception, when a distant cousin's white husband assumed Marcus was catering staff and asked him, not unkindly, to refill the punch. He did not move. No, he said, quiet, final. I paid for this seat, I'm going to sit in it. Casey's smile cracked at the edges. Sir, I understand this is frustrating. It isn't frustrating, Marcus said. It's simple. Her pass says 3C. Mine says 2A. There's nothing here that needs a discussion. A retired schoolteacher named Ruth Alvarez, seated across the aisle in 2C with a paperback splayed open on her lap, glanced up sharply. 69 years old, 31 years in a 4th-grade classroom in Fort Mill, South Carolina, and 31 years of listening to children lie badly enough that she could catch a false note the way a piano tuner catches one wrong string. She heard it now in Deborah's voice, and her mouth tightened into a thin line she didn't bother to hide. Casey looked from the boarding pass to Deborah's tote bag still parked in the middle like a fortress, and made her second mistake of the morning. Sir, she said, voice dropping lower, there are 2 open seats in the 2nd row of first class. I could move you there, plus a meal voucher and… No, one word. Clean, flat, unbreakable. I selected this seat. I boarded with a valid ticket for this seat. I'm not moving because someone else prefers the view. Somewhere in row 4, a young man lifted his phone a few inches, angling it as if checking a text message. He was not checking a text message. Deborah's face hardened into something colder. There it is, she muttered, loud enough for half the cabin to catch it. People always have to turn everything into a fight. People, not him. People. Ruth Alvarez's eyebrow went up half an inch. 31 years of grading essays for coded language had taught her exactly what that word was carrying, and exactly who it was aimed at. Marcus went very still. Not the stillness of surrender, the stillness of a man conserving something, the way you save your strength before a long climb. He had spent decades mastering this particular silence, because he had learned that silence gave people room to reveal exactly who they were. And people always did, sooner or later, if you just let them keep talking. He almost smiled. Not because any of this was funny, because he had heard some version of this sentence, take another seat, go somewhere else, let it go, at every single milestone of his career, and every single time. Giving into it had cost him something he never got back. Casey looked around the cabin. Every face was turned toward them now. She could feel the temperature of the room changing, the particular chill that settles over a plane when a scene threatens the schedule, and, worse, for a certain kind of airline employee, threatens to become somebody's problem to explain later. "Mr." she started. "Whitfield," Marcus said. "Marcus Whitfield." "Mr. Whitfield, I'm going to need to call my supervisor, please do." She turned and walked toward the galley phone, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in first class said a single word. The overhead lights hummed. Somewhere below the floor, a luggage cart rattled past the window, and into that silence, Deborah Sinclair-Voss folded her loose arms across her chest and said, loud enough for the whole cabin, the sentence that would end up quoted back to her, verbatim, in an airline incident report 3 days later. "You people are always looking for something to be offended by." Ruth Alvarez's mouth fell open. A businessman in row 3 lowered his tablet all the way into his lap. The young man in row 4, whose name, for the record, was Devin Marsh, a 26-year-old nurse flying home to Denver after a family funeral in Charlotte, lifted his phone fully now and pressed record without a flicker of hesitation. Marcus did not react with anger. Something quieter crossed his face, an old, tired disappointment, the look of a man who has watched the exact same weather pattern roll in over and over across 38 years, and has simply stopped being surprised that the sky does this. "You saw me for 11 seconds, he said evenly, "before you decided who I was." Deborah opened her mouth. Nothing came out. And that's when a new voice cut in from the front of the cabin. A man's voice, brisk, practiced, already choosing sides before he'd heard a single fact. "What seems to be the problem here?" Every head turned. The man striding up the aisle wore a navy vest with a silver name pin that read Nolan Brecht, Senior Purser. 44 years old, 19 years with the airline. A smooth, practiced calm stretched over features that had learned, over 2 decades, to look neutral while already deciding who was going to lose. His eyes swept the scene in under 2 seconds. Deborah, flushed and clutching her chest theatrically. Casey, stiff and pale near the galley. Marcus, still and unmoving with a boarding pass in his hand. Nolan did not like what he saw, not because Deborah was in the right. Some old, well-trained part of his brain already suspected she wasn't, but because Marcus was too calm, too composed. And in Nolan Brecht's 19 years of experience, composure like that, from a passenger who looked like Marcus Whitfield, read as a threat to be managed, not a fact to be respected. "This man is intimidating me," Deborah said, before anyone else could breathe. I was sitting peacefully, and he came at me, aggressive, demanding I move. "That's not what happened," said a voice from 2 rows back. Frank Delgado, 62, a retired Marine Corps Master Sergeant, on his way to visit his daughter in Boulder, had watched the entire thing without blinking. Not even close to what happened. "Sir, please stay seated," Nolan said, not even looking at him. Frank's jaw tightened. He'd taken orders his whole career. He knew the difference between an order that made sense and one that just wanted quiet. This was the second kind. Marcus spoke, voice level as a carpenter's line. "My boarding pass shows 2A. Her pass shows 3C. I asked her to move to her assigned seat. That's the entire story." Nolan held out his hand. Marcus gave him the pass. Nolan's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned to Casey. "Her pass?" Casey's hesitation lasted exactly 1.5 seconds, but it told the whole cabin everything. "It's 3C, she admitted. "But I always sit here," Deborah snapped, color rising in her cheeks. "I have never, in 11 years of flying this airline, been treated like this." Marcus looked at her and thought about how many people confuse discomfort with injury. A woman being asked to sit in her own paid seat, calling it mistreatment. A man asking to keep what was rightfully his being called the problem. That was how the whole machine worked. It reversed gravity. It made the person standing on solid ground look like the one who'd caused everyone else to fall. Nolan handed the boarding pass back, but not the seat. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, careful, professional, In the interest of an on-time departure, I'm going to ask for your cooperation. We can seat you in 3C. Still first class. I'll authorize free triple miles and a dining credit. Deborah settled back, satisfaction glowing faintly across her face. Marcus did not move. Let me make sure I understand you, he said, quiet, dangerously even. You've confirmed I'm assigned to 2A. Yes. You've confirmed, Mrs. He glanced at her nameplate on the boarding pass Nolan still held loosely. Sinclair-Voss is assigned to 3C. Yes. And your solution is to move me. The cabin went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hiss through the overhead vents. I'm asking you to help us avoid further disruption, Nolan said. The disruption, Marcus said, is sitting in my seat. Deborah gasped audibly, one hand flying to her chest as if she'd been struck. How dare you speak to me like that? Nolan's professional mask slipped half an inch. Sir, I need you to lower your tone. He hasn't raised it once, Ruth Alvarez said sharply from across the aisle. Nolan ignored her entirely. The way people in small positions of authority often ignore inconvenient witnesses who aren't the ones causing trouble for them personally. Something old and cold moved through Marcus then. Not rage. Rage was loud and messy and burned itself out. This was something colder and much more patient. The kind of anger that didn't explode. It documented. It remembered. It waited for its moment, the way water waits behind a dam. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched his phone. Not yet. Just a reminder to himself that real power rarely needs to announce itself before it's ready. Nolan Brecht made his first real mistake in the next 10 seconds, and it was the kind of mistake that ends careers. Mr. Whitfield, he said, voice flattening into something almost bureaucratic. I'm going to need you to step out of the aisle. I'll step out of the aisle, Marcus said, when I sit down. Do you hear him? Deborah crowed. He's refusing crew instructions. Nolan straightened his shoulders, and every trace of the neutral, professional man dissolved into something more brittle. Sir, once a crew member issues a lawful instruction, refusal to comply can result in removal from the aircraft. The word removal traveled down the cabin like a draft of cold air let in through a cracked door. Frank Delgado sat up straighter. For what? Having the correct seat? Sir, remain seated, Nolan snapped. I am seated, Frank said, flat as a rifle report. Devon Marsh's phone stayed level, unwavering, recording every second. Ruth Alvarez leaned toward Casey and whispered something urgent, low enough that only the two of them and Marcus, who had spent a career learning to read lips across a boardroom table, caught it. His pass is valid. Just move her before this gets worse. Deborah heard it too. Betrayal flashed across her face, sharper than the anger had been, because Casey wavering felt, to her, like the world tilting on its axis for the first time in her adult life. I cannot believe this, she said, voice climbing. I am being humiliated because he wants to prove some kind of point. Marcus turned to face her fully for the first time since Nolan arrived. No, Mrs. Sinclair-Voss, you are being asked to sit in your assigned seat. That's all this has ever been. Don't talk down to me. I'm not talking down to you, Marcus said, and something in his voice dropped a full register, quiet enough that the entire cabin leaned in to hear it. I'm refusing to disappear for you. Nobody moved. Casey looked at the floor. Devon's phone stayed rock steady. Frank nodded, once like a verdict being entered into the record. Ruth pressed a hand flat against her own chest. Nolan cleared his throat, trying and failing to drag the room back under his control. Mr. Whitfield, this is your final opportunity to resolve this peacefully. Take seat 3C, or I will notify the captain that you are refusing crew direction. Marcus's hand slid into his jacket and came back out holding his phone. Not fast. Not threatening. Deliberate. The way a man reaches for a tool he's used 1,000 times before and trusts completely. Sir, what are you doing? Nolan asked, and for the first time, something in his voice cracked just slightly. Marcus glanced at the screen. One message from a woman named Priya Anand. Board packet ready for review. Meridian Aerospace call moved up to 2 p.m. They're anxious to close. He read it once, locked the screen, looked back up at Nolan, at Casey, at Deborah, at every silent, watching face in that cabin. Notify whoever you need to notify, he said. Nolan's chin lifted, a last flicker of authority, trying to reassert itself. You're choosing removal. No, Marcus said. I'm choosing the record. Nolan Brecht stepped a few feet back toward the galley. Not far enough to escape the scene, just far enough to make a show of picking up the handset, because performances like this need witnesses too. Captain Rourke, he said into it, voice pitched low and clipped. We've got a passenger in first class refusing crew instruction. Seat 2A. I may need assistance. Casey closed her eyes for half a second. Refusing crew instruction. 4 words that erased everything that had actually happened. The wrong seat, the valid pass, the whispered insult, the unequal weight being handed to one passenger and not the other. 4 words that turned Marcus Whitfield from a wronged customer into an operational hazard. On paper, forever, unless somebody stopped it. Captain Elena Rourke stepped out of the cockpit 90 seconds later. 56 years old, 22 years with the airline, silver threading through dark hair, pulled back severe and tight. 4 gold stripes on each shoulder, catching the cabin light as she walked the aisle. Passengers went quiet the way they always do for a captain. Command changes the temperature of a room, whether it deserves to or not. What's going on here? She asked. Nolan spoke first, of course. Passenger is refusing to move from the aisle after being offered alternate seating. Argumentative. Non-compliant. Casey's head snapped toward him so fast her ponytail swung. So did Devon's camera. He made me feel unsafe, Deborah added quickly, and the word unsafe hit the cabin harder than anything that had come before it, the one word capable of unlocking doors that plain truth alone never could. Captain Rourke turned to Marcus. Sir, I'm Captain Rourke. I understand there's a problem. There is, Marcus said, measured, steady as a heartbeat. A passenger is sitting in my assigned seat. Your crew has confirmed it, twice. Instead of asking her to move, they are asking me to give up what I paid for. It's more complicated than that, Captain, Nolan said. No, Marcus said, it isn't. Rourke studied him for a long moment, then turned to Casey. Is his boarding pass valid? Yes, Captain. Is Mrs. Sinclair-Voss assigned to 3C? Casey's voice nearly broke. Yes. The truth stood up again in that aisle, this time wearing 4 gold stripes worth of authority, and for one clean, suspended second, Captain Elena Rourke had a real choice in front of her. She could end this cleanly. Right there, ask Deborah to move. Protect the dignity of the one passenger who had done everything correctly. Instead, she looked at the phones. She looked at the delay ticking up on the departure board. She looked at the well-dressed widow whose complaint letter would almost certainly land on a regional director's desk before the plane even touched down in Denver. Sir, she said, I'm going to ask you one final time to accept the alternate seat so we can depart. Ruth Alvarez whispered, No. Devon inhaled sharply through his nose. Deborah's mouth curved into a small, satisfied smile, the smile of someone who has just watched the world confirm, once again, that it was built to protect her. That was the exact moment the story stopped being about a seat. Marcus reached slowly back into his jacket and unlocked his phone for the second time. His thumb hovered over the screen for one long second, and every camera in that cabin seemed to lean an inch closer without a single body actually moving. Deborah watched him with a mocking little smile, still fixed in place, convinced this was theater, that men who looked like him always had to perform outrage to compensate for having no real leverage behind it. Captain Rourke saw something else entirely. She saw his hands. Steady. Too steady. Passengers who were bluffing, rushed their words, threatened lawsuits with trembling voices, reached for volume because volume was the only weapon they had. Marcus did none of that. He scrolled with the unhurried focus of a man opening a door that had simply always belonged to him. Casey's throat tightened as she caught the name on the screen before he tapped it. Priya Anand, and beneath it, in smaller letters, Chief Operating Officer. The call connected on the first ring. "Marcus," a woman's voice said, crisp, instantly alert. "Are you in the air yet?" "On the ground still." "There's a situation." He kept his eyes locked on Captain Rourke. "I'm on flight 447, Charlotte to Denver. First class, seat 2A. Another passenger was seated there. Crew confirmed my boarding pass is valid. They confirmed hers is for 3C. Now they're asking me to move and calling my refusal non-compliance." The words came out clean, exact, surgical, the tone not of an angry customer, but of a man dictating facts for a permanent record. There was a short, sharp pause on the line. Then, "Are you safe?" Marcus's eyes flicked briefly to Deborah. "I've been labeled unsafe." Another pause. Then flatly, "Put me on speaker." Marcus tapped the screen. The voice filled the cabin, calm and utterly without theater. "This is Priya Anand, Chief Operating Officer of Halden Kinetics. Who is the senior representative present?" The air in that cabin seemed to physically crack. Nolan Brecht stared at the phone like it had grown teeth. Casey went white. Captain Rourke's spine went rigid. "This is Nolan Brecht, Senior Purser." "And the captain?" "Captain Elena Rourke." "Captain Rourke," Priya said, and her voice did not need to rise even slightly to command the room. "I need you to understand that this call is being logged by our legal and corporate communications team in real time. Marcus Whitfield is the founder and chief executive officer of Halden Kinetics. Your airline's leadership is currently in the final stage of a 9-figure fleet-wide logistics and predictive maintenance contract with our company." Nobody moved. Even Deborah stopped breathing. Halden Kinetics. The name rolled down the cabin aisle like a live wire touching every seat back it passed. A businessman, too, rose up, straightened sharply. Most people who followed aerospace or logistics tech knew the name. A company that built the AI-driven scheduling and maintenance prediction systems. Half the country's regional carriers were racing to license. A company worth, by last estimate, north of $4 billion. A company this very airline had been courting for 11 months. And its CEO had been standing in the aisle the entire time, holding a boarding pass nobody wanted to believe. "Before this call goes any further," Priya continued, "I want a clear answer. Did your crew confirm Mr. Whitfield is assigned to seat 2A? Captain Rourke's jaw worked once hard. "Yes." "Did your crew confirm the other passenger is assigned to 3C? Another silence, longer this time. "Yes." "Then why is Mr. Whitfield the one being asked to move?" No one answered. The silence that followed was louder than any confession could have been. Deborah's eyes darted from face to face, her hand sliding off the bracelet she'd been turning over and over on her wrist. Her lips parted. Nothing came out. "Captain Rourke," Priya said, "I'd suggest you correct this immediately. Not quietly, clearly, in front of the same people who witnessed it happen." Marcus lowered the phone slightly. His face hadn't changed at all. No triumph in it, no smile, only the grave, patient stillness of a man who had simply waited long enough for the truth to become undeniable to everyone in the room at once. And then Deborah Sinclair-Voss said the first honest sentence she had spoken since boarding. "Oh my God." Captain Rourke stared at the phone in Marcus's hand as if it had turned, mid-flight, into something live and dangerous. For the first time since stepping out of that cockpit, she did not look like a woman in command. She looked cornered. "Captain Rourke," Priya said again evenly. "I'm waiting." Rourke glanced at Nolan. Nolan glanced at Casey. Casey looked at Deborah. Deborah looked anywhere but at Marcus. Power had shifted so fast, it left visible fingerprints on every single face in first class. "Ms. Anand," Rourke said finally, clearing her throat, "aircraft operations fall under my authority." "No one is questioning your authority," Priya replied. "We are documenting your judgment." The word landed like a dropped glass. Judgment. Not procedure, not policy, Judgment. The thing this had always actually been, made through skin and clothing and posture and assumption, and now sitting in the open air of that cabin for every camera to keep. Captain Rourke turned, slowly, to Deborah. "Mrs. Sinclair-Voss, you'll need to move to your assigned seat." Deborah's head snapped up. "What? Seat 3C. You cannot be serious. I am. After all of this, you're humiliating me in front of the entire cabin." Ruth Alvarez spoke from across the aisle, without lifting her eyes from her lap.
"No, ma'am, you did that yourself."
A low murmur of agreement moved through the rows. Frank Delgado's phone stayed level, his face carved from stone. Devon Marsh kept recording, his eyes not cold at all, but sad. He had watched enough people unravel in hospital hallways and family waiting rooms to know that this kind of collapse was never pretty, but it was sometimes necessary. Deborah gathered her tote bag with stiff, jerking movements, the leather scraping loudly against the seat console. Her fingers trembled as she rose. For one brief moment she stood in the aisle beside Marcus, close enough to catch the trace of her perfume, powder, and citrus, and something underneath it now that smelled unmistakably like panic. "I didn't know who you were," she whispered, not quite meeting his eyes. Marcus turned his head slightly toward her. "That was never the problem," he said.
Six words.
They took the last of her composure with them, because he was right, and some small, honest part of her knew it instantly. The problem had never been that she failed to recognize wealth. The problem was that she had failed, from the very first second, to recognize a human being. She moved to 3C, watched by every eye in a cabin she had once expected, without question, to command. Casey stepped forward, with a fresh service cloth, and wiped down seat 2A, though it plainly needed no wiping. Her hands moved with a nervous precision that looked almost like penance. "Mr. Whitfield," she said quietly, "your seat is ready." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. She had braced for anger she could have apologized to loudly and moved on from. What he gave her instead was harder to sit with: disappointment. "Thank you," he said. No warmth in it, and no cruelty either. Just finality. He sat down in 2A. The cabin exhaled all at once, but Priya wasn't finished. "Captain Rourke," her voice said through the speaker, "please confirm Mr. Whitfield is now seated in his assigned seat."
"He is."
"In 2A. And please confirm, for the record, that this delay and this escalation resulted from your crew's decision to pressure the valid ticket holder to move, rather than simply correcting the seating error." Nolan looked up sharply. "That isn't fair." "Fairness," Priya said, "was available to everyone in that cabin before you called a paying customer non-compliant for defending a seat he legally owned." Nolan said nothing. Casey looked like the words had struck her directly in the chest, because in a real sense, they had. Marcus ended the call only after Priya added, flatly, "Legal will follow up within the hour. Preserve every crew log, seat scan record, and internal message related to this incident. Nothing gets deleted." The screen went dark. The cabin stayed silent a moment longer, and then, 3 rows up, a low voice murmured to the passenger beside him, "That's Marcus Whitfield. Halden Kinetics." The name spread seat to seat, in a wave of lowered voices and lifted phones, screens glowing faintly in the dim first-class light as search results loaded. Conference, keynotes, a magazine profile calling him one of the most influential young executives in American logistics technology. A photograph of him shaking hands at a Senate hearing on infrastructure automation 18 months earlier. Deborah sat rigid in 3C, as if the leather beneath her had turned to ice. Her handbag rested in her lap, gripped by the same hands that had waved him away less than 10 minutes earlier. Her eyes flicked toward him, then away, toward the black glass of the window, then down at her own dim reflection in her phone's screen. She had always believed power looked a certain way, a certain suit, a certain voice, a certain color of skin. Power was sitting 2 rows ahead of her now, silent and unmoved, and she could not make that fact disappear no matter how hard she tried. Casey moved through the cabin afterward with the stiff, careful grace of someone trying not to fall apart in public. She poured water, collected coats, checked overhead bins, every motion technically correct and visibly hollow. She could still hear Priyanand's sentence looping in her head. Fairness was available before you called him non-compliant, and it hurt precisely because Casey had never once thought of herself as a cruel person. She checked in on nervous flyers. She remembered children's names on long flights. She called herself fair because she never used ugly words out loud. But today she had watched ugly behavior unfold in front of her, and instead of stopping it, she had tried, quietly, to make the calm man pay the price for someone else's certainty. Nolan stayed near the galley, pretending to review something on his tablet. Thumb swiping across a screen he wasn't actually reading. He understood the airline's contract pipeline well enough to know exactly what a name like Halden Kinetics meant to a regional carrier chasing a 9-figure maintenance deal. And he understood, with a cold, sinking certainty settling into his stomach, that he had personally witnessed and personally enabled the exact pattern of behavior his own airline had spent the last 11 months promising Marcus Whitfield's company they no longer had a problem with. A few minutes later, the aircraft door chime sounded again. A gate agent named Patrice Odom stepped aboard, her face carrying the pale, focused urgency of someone who has just taken a call from 3 levels above her usual pay grade. She crossed straight to Nolan and spoke low into his ear. His face went through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds: confusion, disbelief, and, finally, something close to fear. "Mr. Whitfield," Patrice said, turning to him, careful with every word. "Corporate operations is requesting that this aircraft hold at the gate." A murmur rippled through first class. Captain Rourke's voice came sharp from the cockpit doorway. "Hold for what reason?" Patrice's eyes flicked once to Deborah, then to Nolan, then to Casey. Pending immediate review of a passenger discrimination incident. The word discrimination landed in that cabin like something dropped from a great height. It did not whisper. It did not hide behind procedure or preference or comfort. It simply announced itself, plainly in the aisle, in front of everyone. Deborah lowered her head. Nolan looked like the floor beneath him had quietly given way. Casey turned toward the galley wall and pressed both palms flat against the counter, breathing in once, shallow and broken. Marcus stayed seated, belt still unfastened, hands resting easy on the armrests. He did not look around for approval. He did not smile. That unsettled the cabin more than anything that had come before. His restraint carried more weight than anger ever could have. 2 corporate representatives boarded a few minutes later. One was a tall woman in a charcoal suit, dark hair pulled into a smooth low bun, a tablet tucked under one arm. Adaze Coleman, Vice President of Customer Integrity. The other, a pale, visibly rattled man in his early 50s, named Grant Follett, Regional Operations Director. Neither of them looked at Deborah first. Both walked straight to Marcus. "Mr. Whitfield," Adaze said, stopping beside his seat. "I'm Adaze Coleman with the airline's corporate office. I want to apologize directly for what happened on this aircraft today." "Thank you," Marcus said. Grant cleared his throat. "We're going to conduct a full review before this flight departs." Captain Rourke stepped forward. "With respect, this is my aircraft." Adaze turned to her, unhurried. "And this is our company." Rourke fell silent. Adaze looked toward Nolan. "Mr. Brecht, step into the galley with me, please." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He followed her. Grant turned to Casey. "Ms. Doran, you as well." Casey nodded, eyes shining, and as she passed Marcus's row, she paused. "Mr. Whitfield," she said quietly. "I should have moved her the moment I saw her boarding pass." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Just that." The single word hit harder than any forgiveness would have. Casey swallowed and kept walking. Deborah sat rigid in 3C, trying to fold herself smaller into the leather. She had spent the entire morning insisting Marcus belonged somewhere else. Now she wanted nothing in the world except to disappear entirely. Adaze returned several minutes later, her expression controlled but grim. "Mrs. Sinclair-Voss, we need to speak with you at the gate." Deborah looked up, genuinely startled. "Me? I've done absolutely nothing wrong." Ruth Alvarez let out a long, tired sigh. Frank Delgado muttered something under his breath that nobody asked him to repeat. Adaze's expression didn't shift an inch. "Your statements and conduct are part of this review." Deborah's voice cracked. "I didn't know he was someone important." A hush spread across the cabin at that. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. There it was again. The confession hiding inside the excuse, the same one she'd already made once at his seat. Every passenger is someone important. "Mrs. Sinclair-Voss," Adaze said, and the sentence landed over the cabin like a verdict finally being read aloud. Deborah stood, unsteady, and her handbag slipped off her lap and struck the floor with a dull, ugly thud. Nobody moved to help her pick it up. She bent slowly and gathered it herself. And as she walked toward the front of the plane, phones followed her, not cruelly, not gleefully, simply as witnesses. The exact kind of audience she had wanted an hour earlier, back when she still believed the story was going to end in her favor. The flight eventually departed almost 90 minutes behind schedule. But by the time the wheels left the runway, 3 separate clips of the incident were already circulating. Devon's angle, Frank's angle, Ruth Alvarez's own account typed out in a lengthy comment beneath the first upload. By the time the plane crossed into Kansas airspace, the airline's corporate office had issued its first internal suspension notices. Nolan Brecht, indefinite, pending investigation, his 19 years with the company suddenly reduced to a line item in a legal file. By the time Marcus landed in Denver, Halden Kinetics had formally paused contract negotiations pending a full independent review of the airline's crew conduct policies. And within the week, 3 other passengers, 2 of them Black, 1 Latina, all flying that same regional carrier over the previous 2 years, came forward with strikingly similar complaints that had gone nowhere until now, each one previously closed with a form apology letter and a handful of frequent flyer miles. 6 months later, Marcus Whitfield flew that same route again. Different flight number, same first-class cabin. He didn't ask anyone whether things had changed. He simply noticed quietly that the new senior purser greeted every boarding passenger by the seat printed on their pass, not by the clothes on their back. He noticed a laminated card tucked into the seat back pocket, outlining a revised seating dispute protocol, the kind written, he suspected, in the exhausted aftermath of exactly the incident he'd lived through. Casey Doran was no longer with the airline. She had, he later learned, left on her own terms to train new hires at a regional carrier out west, carrying with her, he hoped, the specific weight of what silence costs. Nolan Brecht did not return to flying status. Deborah Sinclair-Voss, it turned out, was quietly informed by the airline that her travel privileges tier, the upgrades, the priority boarding, the compied seat changes she'd enjoyed for 11 years, had been formally revoked following the review, an ordinary consequence that nonetheless landed on her, by every account, like an earthquake. Marcus never spoke publicly about any of it. He gave no interviews. He didn't need to. He touched the small brass button in his jacket pocket. Once, out of habit, somewhere over Nebraska, and thought about his grandmother's kitchen table, the chipped yellow formica. Her voice steady as a metronome. "They can try to make you small, baby. Don't you ever help them do it." He hadn't. That was the part people who watched those videos kept coming back to in the comments, in the quiet retellings that spread far past the original flight. Not the money, not the title, not even the airline's public apology 2 weeks later. Just a man who stood in an aisle, held a valid boarding pass, and refused, calmly and completely, to disappear.
If this story moved you,
Not because of how it ended, But because you recognize someone in it, maybe even yourself, on one side of that aisle or the other, take a moment before you go. Like this video if it made you think differently about a moment you've witnessed and said nothing about. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they are not invisible. And leave a comment answering honestly. Have you ever stood in that aisle, and which side were you on? I read every single one.